In federal judge might be too old for the job news, we turn our attention to the Court of Appeals. I know best, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit is a subject matter court. Unlike most courts in the United States that hear cases coming from that region, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit is national. What makes it different is it hears only certain kinds of cases, most notably patent cases is one of the reasons it was invented as well, and also certain claims against the federal government that ask for money. So they do federal claims and they do the patent cases, and that's what they do. They're a federal court of unified national jurisdiction. Well, one of the judges is named Pauline Newman. She's 95, and some of her fellow colleagues think she's a little old to serve on the bench, but she isn't having it. So let's learn a little bit about this controversy at the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Pauline Newman specializes in dissent. In her 40-year career as a federal judge, she's written 300 dissenting opinions. So when the chief judge for the United States Court of Appeals thought it was time to retire, Newman offered a different view. No. So yeah, every circuit has a chief judge. They're there for administrative reasons to help organize the court and dole out assignments and other things like that. And the chief judge is like, how about retire? He's like, no. And of course, she's a lifetime appointment, so they can't make her. The oldest active federal judge in the nation, because there are some judges that are older, but in retired status, which is a thing you can do. You can retire without resigning. So that makes you a senior judge. And then as a senior judge, you can still hear some cases in a part-time basis, but it allows the slot to become open for other people to use. So she is not retired. She's an active judge. So she's the oldest active judge. She has gone so far as to sue her fellow judges and accuse them of violating the Constitution, which doesn't say anything about mandatory retirement. The colleagues have accused her of misconduct, saying they can no longer do the job she's guaranteed for life. So this is all permeated in a lawsuit that one judge is suing the rest of the court. That's how deep this has gone at this point. So that's all kinds of intrigue over here. So they're like, you need to resign. And they're trying to take things away from her, right? Trying to take assignments away from her, trying to take opinions away from her. Like, we can't force you to resign, but we can try to prevent you from sitting on panels and stuff like that. So she sued them, claiming that she's violated the Constitution because they've effectively ousted her without impeachment. So that's how that's going. It's going great. Newman is working steadily from her light-filled office in Lafayette Square, overlooking the White House and the Washington Monument. I'm not sure I've ever been in her office, but I've definitely been to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. It's a very nice building. It's a little bit kind of like traditional. It's a little bit like it's kind of old in its style, you know, because it's literally right next to the White House. I mean, it's an easy walk. So it's great. She is surrounded by glass awards and photographs of Supreme Court justices. Her court handles patent cases, and so also some diagrams of inventions, including one of her own. She was an inventor at one point in her life. Newman, who turns 26, says she's not going anywhere. It's important to the nation, if I say so, Newman said. If I really were debilitated, as they say, physically and mentally, I'd hope I have sense to step down. But as it is, I feel I can make a contribution and must. That's what I was appointed to do. It's going fine. Now there's a standoff. The court is no longer assigning Newman new cases. So this is one of the things the chief judge can technically do, right? They normally are just like assigning who sits on what panels to make sure that's even and fairly distributed. And if a judge needs to resign or recuse themselves or is not available for a particular case because maybe they're overseas or they're traveling or something, right? So they're kind of like they're the manager, right? They're just to make sure the work is even. If a person needs time off, if they're teaching classes at a university, something like that, to make sure all those needs are balanced. But we've gone so far as the chief judge is now just removing work entirely. So we're trying to oust her by effect. Newman claims she was also stripped of her assistant, a law clerk, and her office computer. Kimberly Moore, who is the current chief judge, has written staffers chose to leave, and the Newman's failure to understand the situation is a sign of her decline. Wow, we're having old people problems over here at the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit for sure. The Federal Circuit is a relatively obscure court, which, it is relatively obscure, all things considered, because it's very subject matter sensitive, right? So it's very, very limited in its role, but very important in my field. and its rulings on patents have impact on the market. But the dispute over Newman's refusal to step down joins one of many debates over how old is too old for a public official to do the job. Federal judges are older than ever, as are presidential candidates vying to nominate them, and also senators who confirm them. Senator Dianne Feinstein is, of course, also facing pressure to resign because that 89-year-old has experienced health problems and cognitive decline as well. Critics say that Newman is an example of unhelpful egoism. He says that she's in a world of rapid technology change and her view is more important than ever, which, fair enough. Newman came of age just as World War II was happening. She learned to fly planes, drive race cars, and ride motorcycles. She became a chemist, and eventually she became a patent attorney, somewhat like me. She helped to create the Federal Circuit in 1982, because it's relatively recent. So yeah, this was something that was created by Congress because they thought they needed a unified system on patents. Before the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, patents were handled by regional circuits. And this, of course, led to circuit splits. And for whatever reason, when it came to inventions, people thought the circuit splits were particularly bad. So the way they solved this problem was by there no longer being circuit splits, because one circuit would hear every single patent case. So there couldn't be a circuit split anymore. So, hey, that's one way to solve the problem, I suppose. So they created the Federal Circuit in 1981, 1982 as part of a presidential commission on industrial stagnation, and then was appointed by Ronald Reagan to serve on the court. So she has been there as long as the court has existed. So she's been there a hot minute. There can be no doubt that Judge Newman is a heroine of the patent system, the chief judge said. The chief judge saying that it's a lesson I've taken to heart is that Judge Newman once told me that her only regret was that she held her tongue, and I think she should never be afraid to say what she's right. I bet Kimberly Moore's regretting that a little bit now, lol. So perhaps it's not surprising in March when Moore urged Newman to retire or take a lighter senior status, which really is the same thing, by the way. At least if we're using the word retire properly, as opposed to resign. But yes, you can retire and keep senior status. That's an option. Newman, who said that she could not because she was the only person who cared about the patent and innovation system, according to Moore. Wow. Judge Newman thinks she's the only one who cared. I don't know. Some of us care at least a little bit. Perhaps it was a bit of an overstatement, Newman said, but she didn't mind the assertion being memorialized, albeit in a court order accusing her of misconduct. So that's fun. The committee made up of Moore and two other judges subsequently expanded its investigation to include allegations that Newman is refusing to cooperate. Her clerks have also been subpoenaed and deposed, some of them apparently taking the fifth because it's going that well. Moore did not respond to requests for comments, but the court has made public nearly a dozen orders issued by committees formed to investigate Newman's current competence. Those filings allege that Newman has shown significant mental deterioration since suffering a heart attack in 2021. She's still going on strong, ma'am. Newman takes longer than other judges to decide cases, they say, and writes fewer opinions. She could not complete a recent online security training, which I've done those trainings before and they're pointless, but yeah, and blames hackers when she cannot find a file on her own computer, according to the committee. She allegedly forgot a court rule in place for the past 5 years, instead referring to a long-dead chief judge. So she forgot who the chief judge was because, that changes from time to time, and she apparently forgot who it was, which is, not great. She's also accused of mishandling a serious dispute between two of her staffers and threatening to have complaining employees arrested. One is quoted as saying, "I believe Judge Newman is simply losing it mentally." Her own staff are not having a great time. Newman has called the allegations either false or grievously distorted, also calling them disconcerting, she said, coming from colleagues that she's known for many years as straightforward, decent people. Two other active judges on the court are in their 80s. Most have served with Newman for at least a decade. Once again, by the way, I'd just like to kindly remind President Biden and the Senate that I am available. I'm 42. I'm a patent attorney. I can do the patents, if you want, or I can do not patents, Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, or something else would be fine. I remain available. I know things. I can help. She denies that she's ever had a heart attack and says she's not conferring with ghosts of past judges. Her hacking concern, she says, is well-founded, saying the judiciary's administrative arm is constantly warning us about hacking and scams, which, to be true, they do. So yes, the judiciary has been targeted for hacking and scams. And they're constantly warned about hacking and scams. So her saying we're warned all the time about hacking and scams is kind of true. The judge is being represented by the New Civil Liberties Alliance, which says it's unconstitutional to force a federal judge to share medical records or undergo psychiatric training or take definite leave, which, to be fair, that makes sense. It's like, I've already been confirmed. You can't make me waive my medical privacy. You can't make me undergo psychiatric tests because there's nothing you can do with the information anyway. And you can't also force me to go off cases. So yeah, it's one thing when your colleagues are saying you're being naughty and the public ought to know you're being naughty, and then Congress can do what you wish, said a former clerk who currently works for the organization that's representing her. It's quite another when judges say we're misbehaving, so we're not going to let you be a judge in anything but name. Going great over here in the federal circuit. Who knew the federal circuit was full of this much drama and intrigue? This could be a great HBO miniseries, I tell you what. Her attorney helps represent for the nonprofit to represent her. He sees the challenge in line with the group's conservative views on government regulations, alongside challenges to COVID mandates, student loan forgiveness, and gun stop bans. Term loans for federal judges might make sense, but it's not the system we have. The lawsuit also argues that Newman is not notably slower or less productive than her colleagues and doesn't write many majority opinions because her specialty is in dissent. So she prefers writing the contrary view to writing the majority view. A 2017 found that Newman dissented in patent cases 290 times in her career, more than 3 times as often as the next closest judge. A woman after my own heart. She prefers the dissent. She prefers to be the contrarian. Well, someone's got to say it, so better for her, I guess. She takes more time because she cares so much, said Janice Mueller, a patent attorney who's known Newman for 30 years, and it says the judge has always been a slow writer. Being a skilled and vociferous dissenter is a very important role to play. I agree, Janice. Also, I liked your book on patent law. It was very good. So, hey, a woman after my own name who is doing fantastic work in this field as well. It's important now, her allies say, as the U.S. Supreme Court has begun weighing in on intellectual property cases more often. Yeah, that's definitely true. The history of the U.S. Supreme Court when it comes to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit is kind of interesting and sort of funny. So when the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit was created in 1981, 1982, for quite a long time, I'd say 25 years, the U.S. Supreme Court kind of left the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit alone. I don't know what it was. Maybe they didn't understand it. Maybe they didn't get it. Whatever it was. But the Court of Appeals, isn't exactly, the Supreme Court just basically never, ever, ever heard anything from the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit for like 25 years. They didn't hear anything from the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. So well up until the middle of the 2000s, 2000 aughts, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit was alone. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit kind of got it into their head that they were the Supreme Court, though, because they were never challenged for so long, and they kind of start thinking they were the Supreme Court. And so, for the last 20 years or so, maybe a little bit less, the U.S. Supreme Court has been whacking the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit around. I think just purely out of spite of at this point, just to remind them that we're Supreme Court, you're not Supreme Court, we're Supreme Court. So yes, patent law has definitely been more interesting at the Supreme Court in the last 20 years than before. And also watching the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit get its ass handed to it constantly is kind of hilarious. Newman's refusal to quit on anyone else's terms but her own served her early in her career. 3 decades after her mother marched for the right to vote, Newman decided that she would be a doctor. No medical school would accept her at the time. She went to graduate school at Yale for chemistry. No chemical firm would hire her. This sounds a lot like Sandra Day O'Connor in a lot of ways. Sandra Day O'Connor also somewhat famously had a lot of trouble getting a job out of law school. I think she was number 3 in her law school on graduation, if memory serves. So she graduated 3rd place in her law school, which, pretty damn good. And she couldn't get a job at a law school doing anything because that's how it was for women at that time. So Newman also had a somewhat similar experience in this domain. She was the only female researcher for the company that eventually did hire her. And her boss was trying to force her into becoming a librarian instead until she threatened to walk out. Good for her. She would later receive her own patent for colorful, dirt-resistant synthetic fabrics that she helped to invent. But after 3 years, she took her savings and bought a ticket to a boat to Paris, where she supported herself by mixing drinks. So doing the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez route. I mean, that's one way of doing chemistry. So she really is a cocktail chemist. Very much a cocktail chemist. Yeah. 6 months later, when she was poor, she came back to the United States and found a job I knew no respectable scientist would take. And that was writing patent applications. Wow. That's a harsh criticism of the patent system. No respectable patent scientist would take the job of writing patent applications. I feel judged. I feel seen. Soon after that, she became a patent lawyer. The next time she went to Paris, it was as a science policy specialist for the UN. On her office desk sits a mug from the bar she couldn't enter during the time at New York University Law. It reads, "Good ale, run onions, and no ladies." She's lived a rich life of tenacity, crawling her way to the top. Good for her. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg praised Newman in 2015 for giving courage to young women with intelligence, diligence, devotion to a very difficult area of law. I mean, patent law does have a bit of a reputation with other lawyers. You know, it was, at least at my law school, it was all the lawyers, the patent lawyers, and the tax lawyers, right? And like the three of us don't talk to each other. So yeah, the patent lawyers were definitely off in their own little world, you know, taken to the island of the misfit toys. So, and the U.S. Supreme Court has often commented about how difficult patent law is and stuff like that. So, you know, the patent bar does have a bit of an air of superiority among itself. So that's fair. The U.S. Constitution says federal judges serve for whatever good behavior means, which we've interpreted to mean life. But okay. Some academics argue that judges can be taken off the bench for behaving badly, whatever that would mean, but who would judge it? Under 1980 law, the active judges of a circuit court can agree to punish a judge after a formal investigation, when the punishment cannot extend to removal or indefinite suspension. So we can discipline you, but we can't fire you. If another judge deems a colleague disabled, they can be appointed by the president, but the disabled judge still cannot be forced to retire. The vast majority of the time, the law is the shotgun behind the door, says a law professor who specializes in this. Threatened with public embarrassment, judges usually step down. But he said for judges willing to die with their boots on, telling them to retire is like giving them the death penalty. Yeah, we're not doing the closed door thing over here. We're not doing it quietly behind the scenes. We're going to do it loud and messy, man. That's Judge Newman's style. Newman's attorneys argue the Federal Circuit Committee has defied the law by taking her off cases as too conflicted to handle the investigation itself, which, you know, who will judge the judges? You know, because it is her own circuit who is judging her. So are they all conflicted, and how would that work? That's an interesting case. The committee says it would consider transferring the probe to a different circuit. If Newman undergoes a medical examination, she'll say that she'll undergo the medical examination only if it's transferred. Ha 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 ha, standoff. Morris suggested going to senior status, which is a part-time status available for those over the age of 65. Veterans of the court say that would give the chief judge control over their caseload, which, you know, it would. It gives them part-time status, which, you know, can be nice for some judges. You get paid the same. You get paid the same and you have less work. So, you know, a lot of judges like it. But some judges are like, no, I want to remain active, damn it. You know, I don't want a lesser caseload. I want more caseload. Screw you guys. I'm not going home. Randall Rader, a former chief judge of the Federal Circuit, I've met him before as well, said he's spoken with Newman recently and found her to be the same Pauline I knew 10 or 20 years ago, as sharp as ever. The court also has a record of dealing with aging members with great compassion without jeopardy to work, by giving them more assistance, said Rader. Judge Giles Rich, who is basically personally invented patent law. Giles Rich is an interesting guy. He basically invented the patent law. He basically wrote the Patent Act. And he was just like basically he was, I think at the time, if memory serves correctly, he was a clerk for like one of the senators. I forget exactly. Yeah, but he didn't have like he wasn't a lobbyist or something like that. He was like basically just an assistant working in some senator's office. And he basically single-handedly wrote the Patent Act. And then he became chief judge of the Federal Circuit. So, you know, because he wrote the goddamn law himself personally. So he's a pretty interesting character. So he served until his death, till 95. And he was, of course, one of the oldest fact judges of the time. Gabe Roth of an organization called Fix the Court, which advocates for a more accountable federal court system, says active members of the federal appeal court should be on the ball 100% of the time. He also compared Newman to Ginsburg, but not favorably. Ouch. There's this idea that permeates the judiciary that only I can do the job. It's hubris. It's really pernicious. Well, I mean, when you've been elevated and elevated and elevated to get the idea that I'm the guy, it's like kind of like, yeah, you've been told you're the guy. It's anti-democratic and monarchical in a way that's not helpful to the ongoing trust. I hate calling out older women being a younger guy, Roth, who's 40, but that's the situation. Yeah, well, that's where we're at. Ginsburg's decision, of course, to stay on past 2016 helped pave the way for the current conservative Supreme Court. So good decision, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I approve of that one. Patent politics are hard to parse. Yeah, they don't really go with party lines. That's for damn sure. In one momentous decision in the field of patents, Justice Thomas voted with liberal members against Gorsuch and Roberts. Yeah, they don't certainly lend themselves to traditional right-left divide. That's for fair, sure. Dennis Crouch, a patent attorney and law professor, met him before. Great guy, runs Patent Leo, smart guy. Said his dispute does not seem ideological to him. It's not. He crunched the numbers, and while Newman is the most patent federal judge, Moore is also close behind. So they look to extend patents and create more patents, and that's part of the reason also the Supreme Court's been whacking them around recently. So more than any other judge is concerned about Newman's health, I think it's real, he said. He suggested Moore, a former electrical engineer for the Naval Service Warfare Center, wants to run a type ship. Naval Service Warfare Center is pretty cool. They do some interesting intellectual property work for sure. Some of it's classified, but they're an interesting organization over the Navy with the intellectual property work. The Navy does a surprising amount of intellectual property work. So, yeah. Newman agrees that there's a lot to be said about term limits, but he thinks that would have to take account for increasing life expectancy and new technology that makes it easier to work in old age. I'm defying the laws of probability, at least my DNA, she said. Her parents lived in the 90s. Her sister died too young at 89. Nice. Newman has never married, has no grandchildren, but has many grand clerks. She's excited by the role of new technology in global conflict or the possibility of lawsuits over coronavirus. Hey, I'm excited about those lawsuit possibilities too. Still, if she had known she lived so long, maybe she would retire from the court and try another career. Would I be a litigator? Would I be an artist? Who knows? But at this stage, I no longer think about what I do in retirement. I want to spend my last 5 years correcting my colleagues' mistakes. A judge after my own heart. A judge after my own heart. I'm going to be cleaning up your mess until I die. Love it. Thus, that brings us to the end of the case of Pauline Newman, a 95-year-old judge who is being whacked around by her colleagues, but she's whacking back, man. She will not leave the bench until she croaks. She's been there for 40 years. She likes the right to dissent. She's a contrarian, and she wants to stay there for 5 more years until she dies so that she can keep correcting everyone else's mistakes because they're idiots. I love this woman. I love this woman so very much. She is a woman after my own heart. She writes dissents, and she's like, all you guys are morons. I'm going to keep trying to tell you you're morons until literally I die. You'll have to take me kicking and screaming off the bench. And she's actually suing her own fellow colleagues at the Court of Appeals for Federal Circuit. You go, Judge Newman, you kick ass. And that, for the moment, brings us to the end of discussion of this story.